Okay. Tonight I want to talk about the animal rights movement moving backwards. I mean, look, the reality is if you're into the large corporate welfarist organizations, you might not like some of the things I'm going to say, which is fine. And we can discuss those things. But I just ask you to listen with an open mind. And, you know, if you disagree, but let's talk about why you disagree during the Q&A session. I got involved with this in the early 1980s. I had been a vegetarian in 1978 when I went to a slaughterhouse while I was in law school. And I stopped eating meat. A year later, I read an article about fish being sentient, so I stopped eating fish. I did not know what a vegan was. I'd never heard the word vegan. I became a vegan in 1982 and got involved with the animal movement about then, about fall of 1982. And so I've been doing this for a while now. And in the 1980s and up to the early 1990s, there were two things that characterized the animal rights movement. One was this idea that we had to reject traditional animal welfare, that the animal welfare movement was not going far enough. And that we needed to be using the language and the concepts of rights. So it was a rejection of animal welfare, and it was also this notion that we needed to move in the direction of abolishing animal exploitation altogether, or at the very least substantially reducing the numbers of animals that were exploited. Different people had different views. And you know, you have to remember, back then, we were talking about animal rights, but really in many ways we didn't know what that meant and where we would go. And unfortunately, where the movement has gone is it's gone from a rejection of welfare and an acceptance of the idea that we need to abolish animal exploitation, or at least substantially reduce it, to an embrace of traditional animal welfare. Basically, animal welfare takes the position that non-humans are of lesser moral value than humans, all right? And it takes the position that as long as we provide animals with a reasonably pleasant life and a relatively pleasant death, we satisfy our moral obligations to them. That's basically the position of animal welfare. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of the animal welfare movement. Animal welfare goes back to the early 1800s in Britain. Up to that point, it's very, very interesting in terms of the history of ideas. Up to that point, animals were excluded completely from the moral and legal community. They were regarded as things that had no moral value whatsoever. In a fairly short period of time, late 1700s, early 1800s in Britain, the paradigm shifts dramatically and people start recognizing that animals do have moral value and that we have moral obligations that we owe directly to animals. Okay, where does this come from? Well, it's complex because it came as a result of, there were a lot of progressive social movements at that time. There was opposition to human slavery. There was a concern about the rights of children. There were concerns about women not being able to vote and things of that. So there were all these progressive social movements, and as part of these progressive social movements, people started talking about non-human animals. There were a number of them. The person who probably has the greatest prominence is Jeremy Bentham, who was a lawyer and a philosopher who wrote a great deal, including a book called The Principles of Morals and Legislation, in which he has this quote that Bentham argued that although a full-grown horse or dog is more rational, more able to communicate than a human infant, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer. What Bentham basically said is because animals can suffer, that fact alone means that we have a moral obligation to not make them suffer unnecessarily. Now, did this mean that Jeremy Bentham stopped eating animals? The answer is no, it did not. Okay? It did not. Why? Because Bentham believed that animals were not self-aware, that they didn't really have a concept of their lives. So if we killed and ate them, as long as we treated them in a reasonable way, we did not harm them because they were not aware. They didn't know what we took from them when we killed them because they had no interest in continuing to live. All right? So Bentham basically says, he said, the death they suffer in our hands commonly is and always may be a speedier and by that means a less painful one than that which would await them in the inevitable course of nature. He's not recognizing that we don't find cows in the anyway, in the inevitable course of nature. We should be the worse for their living, and they are never the worse for being dead. The cow does not care that we kill and eat her. She only cares about how we treat her and how we kill her. Okay? That's what Bentham believed. Now, that was the beginning of the animal welfare movement. As a result of acceptance of these ideas that Bentham and John Stuart Mill and Humphrey Primat and a whole bunch of other people articulated, we started getting animal welfare laws. That you had to do this humanely, you had to do that humanely, and and this is where animal welfare came from. Now you can say, well, wait a minute, that's crazy. How can people think that animals don't care that we kill them as long as we treat them all right, that they don't have an interest in continuing to live? Interestingly, that is exactly the position that Peter Singer takes. That's exactly the position that Peter Singer takes. Okay? He takes the position that animals do not have an interest in continuing to live, that if we kill them, killing them is not harming them per se, because if they don't have an interest in continuing to live, killing them does not harm them because you're not taking an interest from them. They don't have an interest in continuing to live. So therefore, killing them does not harm them per se. So Singer says things like, while self-awareness, the capacity to think ahead, have hopes and aspirations for the future, the capacity for meaningful relations with others and so on, are not relevant to the question of inflicting pain. What he means by that is, if I'm not self-aware, that's not relevant to the issue of inflicting pain. If I can feel pain, it doesn't matter whether I have future hopes or whether I have memories. I can feel pain now. And so therefore, my lack of self-awareness is irrelevant to the imposition of pain. However, he goes on to say, it is not arbitrary to, he says, these capacities are relevant to the question of taking life. It is not arbitrary to hold that the life of a self-aware being capable of abstract thought, planning for the future, or complex acts of communication, and so on, is more valuable than the life of a being without these capabilities. So basically, he's saying that the life of a being who is not self-aware is not worth as much as the life of an individual who is self-aware. Okay? So he's basically saying animals are not as morally valuable as humans. They have lesser moral value because they are incapable of complex acts of communication. They don't use symbolic communication, what we call our language. They are unable to form beliefs about the future. They don't have memories of the past. I mean, I have to tell you, I find this profoundly wrong as an empirical matter. I live with 6 rescued dogs. They're all abuse. Well, 5 of them are abuse cases. One came from a tragic situation, but not an abuse situation. And it is remarkable to me that anybody would say that animals are incapable of having future beliefs, or that they don't have memories, or that they don't have an interest in continuing to live. But anyway, let's go on for a second. This is Singer. This is from Animal Liberation. Okay? This is from Animal Liberation. An animal may struggle against a threat to its life even if it cannot grasp that it has a life in the sense that requires an understanding of what it is to exist over a period of time. But in the absence of some form of mental continuity, it is not easy to explain why the loss to the animal killed is not, from an impartial point of view, made good by the creation of a new animal who will lead an equally pleasant life. Okay? This is the father of the animal rights movement, which explains in a way about why we're in the mess that we're in. Because what has happened from the early 1990s to now is the movement, which is basically a group of corporate welfare organizations. The movement has embraced Singer's view. There are no large organizations that don't promote Singer. None, not one. Okay? They all basically promote Singer's views. And Singer's views, Singer talks about the great apes, for example, because he thinks that because the great apes are more human-like, then using them and killing them may present a greater moral problem because they're self-aware. And he has talked about maybe elephants and maybe dolphins. But with respect to the animals we routinely exploit, he believes they are not self-aware. And so that our primary obligation is to lessen their suffering in our exploitation of them. This is just one of the, I could give you Singer quotes endlessly, but I will not. You could say it's wrong to kill a being whenever a being is sentient or conscious, which I maintain it is. Then you would have to say it's just as wrong to kill a chicken or a mouse as it is you or me, which I believe. I can't accept that idea. It may be just as wrong, but millions of chickens are killed every day. I can't think of that as a tragedy on the same scale as millions of human beings killed. What is different about humans? Humans are forward-looking, and they have hopes and desires for the future. That seems a plausible answer to the question of why it's so tragic when humans die. Okay? This is Singer. This has been embraced by all of the large corporate welfare charities. All of them basically accept this view. In 2005, something very important happened. Singer got all of these organizations, Animal Rights International, PETA, Farm Sanctuary, Humane Society of the United States, Mercy for Animals, Vegan Outreach, Viva, Northwest in Defense of Animals, a whole bunch of these organizations, to send a letter to John Mackey. John Mackey is the CEO of a corporation called Whole Foods. It's a chain of high-end markets, supermarkets, which sell happy meat and cage-free eggs and wonderfully happy milk and, you know, whatever. And Singer wrote a letter to Mackey, which was on the Whole Foods website for about 2 years, with all of these organizations expressing appreciation and support for the happy exploitation standards that Whole Foods was in the process of developing. Okay? This was in 2005. It was, in my judgment, this was the beginning of the end. This was really, what was happening through the 90s was there was a continual drift back. Okay? There was a continual drift back to animal welfare, but most of the organizations were somewhat embarrassed by it. And they want to say, no, we're not supporting animal. It changed in 2005. In 2005, Singer and all of them basically came out and said, we support animal welfare. This is a disaster, because what has happened in the intervening 10 or 11 years is all of the animal organizations have now partnered with institutional animal exploiters to promote the idea that there's a right way to do the wrong thing, that we can be compassionate animal exploiters. In my judgment, that is wrong. It is nonsense. All right, now, let me explain why, the reasons why I think this is wrong. I believe that the theory that only humans are self-aware is blatantly speciesist. Why? Because it assumes that the only sort of awareness, or the only sort of self-awareness that counts morally, is what we have as normal adults. Okay? We can look in the mirror, we recognize ourselves. Okay? We can think autobiographically. Does that mean we're self-aware? Of course it means we're self-aware. But is that the only way of being self-aware? And the answer is no, of course not. Let's think about this for a second. Okay? First of all, I think as an empirical matter, animals do have future beliefs and they do have past memories. I think that that's clearly, and I believe there's lots of research to show that. However, let's assume that non-humans live in what Singer thinks of as an eternal present, that they're just stuck in the moment. They don't think about the future, they don't think about the past, they only think about the present moment in which they are in. They are basically in an eternal present. Let's think about that for a second. Let's assume that's true. There are some humans who are in an eternal present. There's certain forms of amnesia. Okay, there are certain forms of amnesia where people are unable to form beliefs about the future, and they are unable to remember anything about the past. They are literally stuck in an eternal present. Consciousness, just a series of linked moments of consciousness. Now, does that mean they're not self-aware? And the answer is no, that doesn't mean that they're not self-aware. It means that, it means that they're self-aware in a different way. Is that difference morally relevant? And the answer is yes, of course it's morally relevant for certain purposes. If George Brown College is looking to hire a history professor, it would not be a good idea to hire somebody who has a form of amnesia that makes that person unable to think about the past or unable to think about the future. That would be morally relevant if the question is, who do we hire to teach history? If the question is, who do we use as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor, it is completely irrelevant. Okay? Because the person who has got amnesia is aware of herself or himself in each second. So there is a perception, the person, I have talked with people who have transient global amnesia, and it's fascinating. They literally, they cannot form a belief about what they're going to do in 5 seconds. They don't remember what they did yesterday, but they have a sense of themselves right then. If you say to them right then, excuse me, is it all right if I take your kidney and your liver and your heart? They would say no. No, because they want to get to the next second of consciousness. So even if animals are stuck in an eternal present, which I do not believe empirically is the case, even if they are, that would still not mean that they're not self-aware. Okay? And so I think this idea that Singer has, and that is really sort of bought into by most of the animal welfare, most of the quote animal advocates, is that really killing isn't the problem. The problem is suffering. Is suffering a problem? Sure, it's a problem. But isn't it interesting that an animal stuck in a trap will gnaw off the animal's paw, which is very painful. Try that sometime. Try sort of biting into your wrist, okay? Really hard. And I mean, don't do it now because Akaratzi might have liability, and I don't want that to happen. An animal will chew off his or her paw to get out of a trap, will endure enormous amounts of pain. Why? Because that animal wants to live. It doesn't, in order to say you have an interest in life, doesn't mean you have to be able to think, I have a life, and next year I'm going to go on a vacation, I'm going to Sweden, and last year I went to Nicaragua. I mean, that's one way of being self-aware. And it's one way of thinking about the life that you have, but it's not the only way. And to say that a sentient being, i.e. a being who is subjectively aware, to say that that being does not have an interest in life is absurd. Sentience is nothing more than a means to the end of continued survival. To say that a sentient being does not have an interest in continuing to live is like saying that a being with eyes does not have an interest in continuing to see. Sentience is a characteristic which we use to survive, which we use to continue to live, and which every being who is sentient uses to continue to live. So this idea that you can be sentient but not have an interest in continuing to live, or that the only animals who have an interest in continuing to live are non-human great apes, or elephants, or dolphins, or whatever, but forget about the chickens, forget about the cows, forget about the pigs, forget about the fish, forget about all of the animals we routinely exploit, is, in my judgment, species is nonsense. So the basic premise that animals, that there's a fundamental difference between humans and non-humans that mean that their life has a lesser moral value than our lives, is fundamentally flawed, is fundamentally speciesist. There's no justification for that belief other than saying members of different species don't count as much as we do. Okay. Second reason, because animals are property, animal welfare regulation is a disaster. Remember something, animals are property, you know? I mean, I love my dogs. I don't regard them as members, as a property. I regard them as members of my family. But you know what? As far as the society is concerned, as far as the legal system is concerned, they are property. If I value them at zero, I can take them to a shelter and dump them tomorrow and say, kill them. You don't find a home for them, kill them. I can take them to a veterinarian and say, kill my dog. Because it's my property. If I wish to value my property high, I can value my property high. I can say, I regard these dogs, my property, as members of my family. Just as I can decide to take better care of my car, I can wax my car every week. Okay? That's my property. If I choose to do that, I can do it. If I just want to, keep my car in basic repair so that I can get through the inspection every year, I can do that as well, because that's what it means to be a property owner. Okay? That's what it means to be a property owner. I own my dogs. You have dogs, cats, birds, rabbits, whatever you've got, they're your property. You wish to value them at zero, you may. That is what it means to be a property owner. So animals have interests, but it costs money to protect their interests. So if you've got chickens or pigs or cows, the more interest protection that you give them, the higher the cost is. So, could you raise animals in a much better way? And the answer is yes, it'd be more expensive. And so you're dealing with billions and billions of animals. We kill 60 billion land animals and 1 trillion sea animals every year. Trillion is a million. I mean, those numbers are mind-boggling. 60 billion land animals a year. Mind-boggling. Okay? And so we've got markets, international markets in these creatures. We sell them. We sell hog futures and we sell animal futures on the stock markets. These are things that have no inherent intrinsic value. They only have extrinsic, external value. Okay? They have no value except economic value. It costs money to protect their interests. And we generally only protect their interests when we get a benefit, and that most of the time that benefit is a financial benefit. Animal welfare does nothing more than to ensure that we exploit animals in an economically efficient way. Let me give you an example. This was actually, I wrote a whole book on this in the mid-90s called Animals, Property, and the Law, where I looked at animal welfare regulation that in both Britain and the United States, and I concluded that in most cases, in almost all cases, animal welfare reform made animal exploitation more economically efficient. Let me give you an example. 1958 Humane Slaughter Act in the United States, which required large animals, cows, pigs, sheep, to be stunned before they are shackled, hoisted, and cut. If you look at the legislative history behind the 1958 Humane Slaughter Act, what you see is Congress expressing the concern that animals who are not stunned when they're slaughtered move around a lot. And what happens when animals move around a lot? They hit workers, and they cause worker injuries. And the other thing that happens is they incur carcass damage. Because they're moving around, because they're panicked, because, basically, I don't know however many of you have been in a slaughterhouse. How many of you have been in a slaughterhouse? Okay, so not very many of you. They're horrible places. But you know, if you've got a cow, when you put a chain around a cow's back leg and you hoist her up, what happens is, the first thing that happens is her pelvis breaks. You're talking about like a 2,000-pound animal, right? And so you hang her upside down and her pelvis breaks. She's in a lot of pain. She's moving around a lot. Okay? And so she's hitting workers, she's struggling like crazy, she's causing worker injuries, and she's incurring carcass damage. And when that carcass is damaged, the economic value of the meat is lessened. So Congress says, look, you know, these animals are suffering needlessly, and there are worker injuries, and there is carcass damage, so we're going to require that the animals be stunned before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut. Now, in reality, in a lot of slaughterhouses, the animals are not unconscious when they're cut and when they're skinned and when their hooves are cut off. They're stunned so that they're not moving. I mean, for example, with a pig, you've got to keep those, I mean, they use different methods. With cows, they use captive bolt stunning devices. With pigs, it's a real problem, because pigs, they use an electric device which basically goes on the temples, and you have to keep that thing on the pig's head for a fairly long period of time before the animal's going to be unconscious through the entire slaughtering process. And what they generally do, or what they often do, is they touch the electrodes, and so the pig gets a zap of electricity. Pig falls over, and then they start the slaughtering process. So when the pig is hanging upside down, the pig is becoming, you know, the pig is quite conscious. The pig is just immobilized in the same way that you'd be immobilized if you had been tasered or something like that. So if you come to the United States, we have police departments all over who will gladly taser you. But in any event, the thing is that interestingly, go and read. You don't believe me? Go to my website, abolitionistapproach.com. Sorry, abolitionistapproach.com. And I have the documents from PETA and the Humane Society, because they're now arguing that chicken producers ought to gas chickens rather than use the hideous way of killing them that they use now. And what is the argument that PETA's making? PETA's saying that there's a lot of carcass damage that is caused by the present method of slaughtering chickens, and that you'll cut down on the carcass damage. There are worker injuries, because even though chickens moving around don't cause the sort of injury that cows hanging upside down moving around cause, there's still a lot of worker injuries, because there's blade going all the time, there's hot water for the defeathering, there's an electric bath that's supposed to render them unconscious, so there's electricity, there's water, there's knives, there's hot water, there's a lot of worker injuries in slaughterhouses, in chicken slaughterhouses. So the argument is, look, you can do this more efficiently. You can actually increase the production efficiency of exploitation by gassing them rather than using the method that is used now. That's what animal welfare is. It's working with industry to make industry more efficient. All of the welfare reforms are things that will happen anyway. And this is actually one of the interesting things. If you look, for example, at Europe, the fact that now in Europe, basically, the veal crate is pretty much phased out. Why? Because they figured out that when you've got a calf tethered in a crate, and that calf can't interact with others, they're mammals, they're just like us, they like social interaction, okay? And so if those animals can't have social interaction, they get stressed. When they get stressed, they get sick. You've got to keep those animals alive for 6 months for veal calves until you can get them to slaughter. So to the extent they get sick, you've got to spend money on veterinarian fees. So what has happened in Europe? What's happened in Europe is they've taken the veal calves out of the crates, and they have them in these little tiny, I mean horribly small, but they can touch each other, they can nuzzle each other, they can put their faces next to each other, they can lick each other. Okay? And so as a result, the veterinary costs go down. And at the same time, everybody says, hey, I feel better about eating veal. You know, veal was actually one of the things that in the 1990s, people said, I don't want to eat veal. You know, I mean, frankly, I always thought that was crazy. There's no difference between veal and anything else. But people said, well, you know, veal is really horrible. But so people stopped eating veal. Now people are eating veal again. Because they say, well, you know, they're not raising it that way. The veal consumption in Europe as a result of getting rid of the veal crate has gone up. Okay? So these welfare measures are things that would happen anyway And what ends up happening is you have these large animal organizations, they sit around, they look at economically vulnerable practices. Because they read the economic agricultural journals, they identify economically vulnerable practices, they go after them because they're on their way out anyway. Farrowing crates for pregnant pigs, they're on their way out. There are other ways of dealing with pregnant pigs which are much more economically efficient, like electronic sow feeding, for example. Much more efficient. The whole industry is moving in this direction. Meanwhile, the animal people are saying, we've got great victories, we've got them to change. They didn't get them to change. All that's happened is what was going to happen anyway, because it's economically efficient. And then the animal people are busy saying, we've got a great victory, give us a donation. It is complete nonsense. Okay? The bottom line is animal welfare standards, because animals are property, will generally do little, if anything more, than make animal exploitation more efficient. Animal welfare regulation, single issue campaigns, anti-fur campaign, anti-foie gras campaign, those sorts of things, single issue campaigns. Animal welfare campaigns, single issue campaigns, actually perpetuate animal exploitation. Keyword, coalition. What do I mean by that? What I mean is look at how these organizations promote these things. Let's look at foie gras, for example. They say, oh, foie gras, horrible. So they get a coalition of donors together who will contribute money to this, all of whom agree foie gras is terrible. Some portion of the coalition, they will be vegans. But many of those people will not be vegans. And the only way you get their support, the only way you get their donations, okay, is to promote the idea that foie gras is worse than other animal foods, and that it is morally worse to consume it. By implication, it is morally better to consume other animal products. Okay? So these campaigns actually perpetuate animal exploitation, because what happens is, whether it's cage-free eggs. So you say, oh, let's get a this is not the big thing. This is not the big thing, and it's ridiculous. This idea. How many of y'all have been in a cage-free facility? It's one big cage. Well, it's one big cage. You get rid of the conventional battery cage, and now you have cage-free, which is basically one large cage. They're still pecking each other. They're still crapping on each other. They're still urinating on each other. It's horrible. Those places are absolute hellholes. Okay? But what you do is you get a coalition together of people who say, hey, we think battery eggs are horrible. We're going to continue to eat eggs because we're better people. We want to eat cage-free eggs. We want you to eat cage-free eggs. This is our campaign for cage-free eggs. You can continue to eat eggs, just not the ones in conventional battery cages. Hell, you don't even have to eat cage-free ones. You can eat ones from the enriched cages, which is now, in Europe, the standard, enriched cages. It's like slightly bigger cages. Okay? And so this is great. But what you're doing is you're making coalitions of animal exploiters, okay, and people who don't believe in animal exploitation. But in order for that coalition to hang together, in order to get the contributions you need and the support you need to get these campaigns financially, to bring in the money, you've got to promote the idea that the people who are eating steak instead of foie gras are better people. The people who are eating cage-free eggs as opposed to conventional battery eggs, they're better people. Because that's a better thing to do. That's a morally acceptable thing to do. Because the reality is that if you are not a vegan and you're involved in one of those campaigns, you ain't going to be involved in one of those campaigns very long if you believe that the campaign is taking the position that what you're doing is as bad as what you've targeted. Think about it. It's common sense. Who will do that? Who's going to be part of a campaign where the campaign is saying, what these people are doing is bad, and what you're doing is bad too? No, because if once you say to me, what you're doing is bad, then I say, okay, if I'm not convinced of the vegan thing, I ain't going to give you any more money. Creates coalitions, perpetuates animal exploitation. These campaigns create partnerships between animal advocates and industry. This is Buy My House. This is a Whole Foods by my house. Whole organic chicken, $1.99 a pound. How very sad that the lives of these poor animals. Chickens are horribly treated, and we don't really have much regard for them. Most people think of them as stupid. They're not stupid at all. Not that that would matter. I mean, stupidity is not really. I mean, in my country, we have made people of limited cognitive ability president of the United States. And so and we may do it yet again. And so you got $1.99 a pound for whole organic chicken, and that sticker is this animal welfare rating 2. I mean, this is Whole Foods. Think about how diabolical this is. They got 5 you got animal welfare rated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Choose your level of torture. Now, this animal welfare rating, comes from an organization. This is the stuff that all of these animal groups promote. Okay? This is the sort of thing they promote. Wayne Pacelle, whom I've known for many years, Wayne Pacelle, who's chairman or CEO and president of the Humane Society of the United States, sits on the board of directors of the Global Animal Partnership, which formulates the standards and decides what level 1 torture is, what level 2 torture is, what level 3, what level 4, what level 5 is. He is the CEO and president of the Humane Society. Okay? These are partnerships. This is certified humane, raised and handled. This is now the big thing. Labels. Let's put labels on the animals we exploit to make people feel that they're doing something better. So this involves the ASPCA, HSUS, other animal organizations that are involved with the certified humane rating. And there's a bunch of these. There's the Whole Foods one, the animal welfare rating system. There's this label. In Britain, there's Freedom Food. I mean, there's a bunch of these labels where basically animal advocates are working with animal exploiters and producing animal products that have the stamp of approval of animal advocates. Don't tell me this is not perpetuating animal exploitation. This is PETA giving an award to Whole Foods. PETA giving an award as the best animal welfare friendly supermarket chain. They also gave an award to Temple Grandin. Temple Grandin is the woman who designs humane slaughterhouses. They gave her an award. They gave her visionary award. They called her a visionary. This is a woman who designs slaughterhouses. This is, from my friends at Mercy for Animals, this is Nathan Runkle sending out progress. Walmart announces sweeping animal welfare policy. Are you going to tell me, those people who are critical of my position, you're going to tell me that this is not promoting animal exploitation? Are you going to tell me that people don't look at that sort of thing and say, yeah, wow, as long as I buy what I'm going to buy at Walmart, that's great. That's what I got to do. I've got, the revolution begins at Walmart. Come on. This is Bell & Evans Chicken. They're a big chicken seller. And here is my friend Ingrid Newkirk, president of PETA. Bell & Evans, this is a quote. Bell & Evans shows that animal welfare and good business can go hand in hand. And by listening to consumers' wishes, Bell & Evans has set a new standard for the chicken supply industry. Now, when you got PETA making a statement like that, can you honestly say to me that this is not sending a message to people that eating Bell & Evans chicken is morally acceptable? Because if you believe that, then you understand English differently from the way I understand English. I do not see how you can read that without saying that's an imprimatur, a stamp of approval by PETA of eating Bell & Evans chicken. The animal movement encourages people to believe there's a right way to do the wrong thing. It encourages continued exploitation. So what's the alternative? The alternative is what I call the abolitionist approach to animal rights. I just used to call it animal rights in the 1990s, but since animal rights has become a meaningless term, I stopped calling it that, and I now call it abolitionism. And then when that becomes a meaningless term, because you're already starting to see the large groups that promote welfarism saying, well, really, abolitionist. You're starting to see that. So in another 10 years, I'll have to come up with something else. But for right now, I call it the abolitionist approach to animal rights. Basically, I maintain that all sentient beings, all you have to do is be sentient, okay? Then you have to have the right to be, not to be regarded as property. Animals are, as I said to you before, animals are classified as property. They have no they have only external extrinsic value, okay? We recognize that was a disaster when we talked about human slavery. I mean, whatever differences we may have about what constitutes discrimination, everybody rejects human slavery. It doesn't mean human slavery doesn't exist, it still exists, but nobody defends it. Everybody acknowledges that human slavery is a particularly odious form of treatment of humans. Why? Because if you're a human slave, you're a piece of property, you're outside of the moral and legal community completely. You have no intrinsic or inherent moral value, you only have economic value. And however much we may agree or disagree about socialized medicine or about certain other issues, we can have disagreements about things. Nobody defends slavery. Why? Because we recognize that if you are a human slave, you are outside the moral and legal community altogether. Okay? And so therefore we maintain that every human being, irrespective of characteristic, whether beautiful or not beautiful, whether smart or not smart, doesn't matter. Basically, no human being should be regarded or treated or used as a human slave. I maintain that that is the case with non-humans as well. There is no way, you cannot use species to distinguish humans from non-humans in this way. So in other words, whatever characteristic you think that non-humans have that justifies treating them as things, some group of human beings has that characteristic or that defect or whatever it is you want to call it. But we would never think that it's appropriate to use humans as resources. We've got to come to the same position when it comes to animals. All animals have one right, the right not to be used as property. However, if we recognize that one right, it means we must abolish and not regulate animal exploitation. Basically, principle 2, we maintain that recognition of the one basic right means we must abolish, not merely regulate. We don't support welfare reform campaigns, don't support single-issue campaigns. I mean, let me tell you something about single-issue campaigns. When I first got involved in this, I still remember sitting in the library at the University of Virginia, where I went to law school and graduate school in philosophy. But I remember being in the library of UVA, and there was a big article, a full-page ad in the New York Times, okay, about fur and how bad fur was. That was like 1978, 79, okay? The fur industry is stronger now than it was then. As a matter of fact, before the recession, it was incredibly strong, and it's still strong, still very strong. Okay? Single-issue campaigns don't work. There is no difference between fur, wool, leather, silk, no difference whatsoever. Okay? Absolutely none. These single-issue campaigns just send out the wrong message. They send out the message that some forms of animal exploitation are worse than others, and by implication, some forms of animal exploitation are better than others. They send out the wrong message. They don't change the paradigm. All they do is confuse people. Okay? Don't support welfare reform campaigns or single-issue campaigns. There is no difference between foie gras and steak. None whatsoever. Absolutely none. Principle 3. Abolitionists maintain that veganism is moral baseline. There is not one of these corporate welfare charities maintains that veganism is a moral imperative, by which I mean we have a moral obligation to be vegan. To the extent that these groups talk about veganism, they talk about it as a way of reducing suffering. Okay? They talk about it as a way of reducing suffering. Along with cage-free eggs and crate-free pork and all this other stuff. No. Veganism is about fundamental rights. Veganism is a matter of justice. If animals matter, we cannot eat them, wear them, use them. It is that simple. You are either a vegan or you are participating directly in animal exploitation. There is no third position. Okay? And there also, vegetarianism is an incoherent moral position. There's no distinction between vegetarianism, between eating meat and eating dairy or eggs or any other animal products. I am very active in the Jain community in North America. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be giving a major talk at Florida International University in October, the Mahavir lecture. And I tell my friends in the Jain community, Jains are by and large vegetarians. As a matter of fact, I've met very few Jains who aren't vegetarian. But they eat meat, they eat dairy, they eat eggs. There is no distinction. There is no distinction between dairy and eggs and meat. It all involves suffering, it all involves torture, it all involves injustice, it all involves death. The animals that are used for dairy are kept alive longer, they're treated every bit as badly as animals used for meat, and they all end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. I mean, I have to tell you, I have been, and I won't go, well, I can't get in them anymore anyway, but I mean, I have been in probably 30 slaughterhouses in my life, all sorts of them. And also, I've been in every sort of slaughter. I've been in pig slaughterhouses, cow slaughterhouses, calf slaughterhouses, chicken slaughterhouses, everything. One of the worst things I've ever seen was, some years ago, I got a call from an organic dairy farm in New England. And they said, we've been reading what you're writing and you're just wrong. And I just love when people say you're just wrong. And I say, okay, fine. So prove to me I'm wrong. They say, well, you come and spend several days at our farm and you'll see that you're wrong. And I had to sign an agreement that I wouldn't disclose where the farm was or whatever. And I went and I spent 3 days. And it confirmed everything I thought about dairy. It was an organic farm where supposedly the cows are permitted to keep their calves for a few days, because in conventional dairy production, the calves are born, they're often taken away the same day, sometimes, sometimes the same day, sometimes the next day, but basically they do not stay with their mothers beyond a day. And these organic happy farms, these ahimsa dairy farms, they are allowed to stay with their mothers for a few days. And I will tell you, I was there when the babies were taken away. And I heard those cows cry. I mean, they cry. I couldn't sleep. One of the nights I was there, I could not sleep. When I have nightmares, when I'm under stress and I have nightmares, the two nightmares I have are the first slaughterhouse I went to in 1978, which in certain ways was no worse. It was just the first one I went to. It was no worse or no better than anything. They're all horrible. They're all hellholes. Is when I had that first slaughterhouse I went to, and that dairy farm. That dairy farm. Dairy farms are horrible. If you're consuming dairy, stop. There is no distinction. There's no morally relevant distinction between dairy and meat. Please, if you're not vegan, if you're not vegan and you care about animals, you really need to take seriously. You have a moral obligation to stop eating, wearing, using animal products. You have a moral obligation. That's what I mean by moral imperative. It's a moral obligation. You've got it right now. It ain't a question of your journey. It ain't a question of your compassion. It's a matter of justice. And I would love to get two words I'd like to get out of the English language: compassion and journey. I just can't stand people say, journey. And then they have, baby steps. Baby steps are for babies. Okay? Baby steps are, think about this for a second. If I said to you, racism is a real problem, so let's have racist joke-free Monday. Because racism is still a horrible problem. I mean, we've got Obama's president. People think, well, there's no more racism. There's horrible racism in the United States and everywhere else. And so the idea, that we would say, well, racism's a problem. So is rape. 1 in 4 American women, by the time they get to age 22, has either been the victim of rape or attempted rape. Okay? That's shocking. And you know what? My guess is that's probably low. That's probably low. So, I would imagine it's probably more that, towards half the women, not necessarily victims of violent stranger rapes, but of acquaintance rapes, which is still a major problem. Okay? So if we say, well, let's have rape-free Monday, we would all say, that's nonsense. We can't accept that. That's morally obscene. It's morally obscene when we talk about meat-free Monday. Okay? It's not even vegan Monday. Meat-free Monday. Okay? Or reducitarianism. Oh, you're a moral person if you cut back the number of animals that you can. No. Okay? Just as we would not say, oh, you're a reducitarian, you're molesting fewer children. Normally you molest 10, now you're molesting 9. Good, good, let me pat you on the head. We would never do that where fundamental human rights are concerned. We shouldn't do it where animals are concerned. By the way, you know, before anybody tells me, oh, but you know, not going to get people to go vegan over. You know what? Yeah, I know. You're not telling me anything I don't know. I know we're not going to get everybody to go vegan overnight, okay? But the reality is, if we continue to do what we're doing now, all we're going to do, we're exploiting more non-human animals now in more horrific ways than we ever have in human history. Continuing the way we're continuing ain't getting us anywhere. It is causing millions and millions and billions of dollars to go to these large corporate animal welfare charities. Why? Because people want to buy, just like people did in the Middle Ages when they wanted to engage in sinful activities. They would buy a license from the church, basically. The indulgence, right? Thank you. As I get older, I forget that. And so they would get an indulgence. That's what these organizations are doing. They're the equivalent of the medieval Catholic Church selling licenses to people to exploit. If you have 50,000 vegans in Canada, 50,000, and I don't think anybody would say it's that low. If every vegan turned one other vegan on in the coming year, you'd have 100,000. And then if everybody did 200, 400, 800, 16, 32, 64, 12, 8, 25, 6, and then you got a vegan Canada because the population is 35 million. So if everybody did nothing but turned one other person on to veganism in the coming year, we could have a vegan Canada in a fairly short period of time. Now that ain't going to happen. I understand it ain't going to happen. But the point is, the idea that nonviolent, creative vegan advocacy is not activism is, I would call it bullshit, but it would be to insult bullshit as a concept. To say, and it makes me very angry when I hear people say, well, veganism can't be the moral baseline, activism has to be the moral baseline. I'm sorry. We have to give content to the concept of activism. And if you are doing animal work and you are not talking about veganism as a moral baseline, there's something terribly confused in the way that you're thinking about these issues. Principle four is that sentience is the only characteristic that matters. The only characteristic that matters. That is, I really have a serious time with this issue that, non-human great apes matter more, elephants matter more, dolphins matter more, because they're more like us. To me, that's like saying, well, light-skinned blacks are more like us, so they matter more than dark-skinned blacks, which is actually, a problem. And so, because they're more like us, they're more like white men. And we are the paradigm. Therefore, and if the more you're like us, you're fine, okay? You're never going to be us. But the more you're like us, the more moral value you have. As far as I'm concerned, if you're sentient, I don't care how smart you are, I don't care what your cognitive characteristics are beyond your subjective awareness, that's the only thing that matters. Principle 5. We reject all forms of human discrimination, racism, sexism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, classism. The problem is speciesism. Speciesism otherizes non-human animals on the basis of species, and we say, well, that's not right. Species is morally irrelevant. But it's also morally irrelevant. It's morally irrelevant because it's like race. It's like sex or gender or sexual orientation or sexual preference or class or ability. These are all morally irrelevant characteristics that are used to otherize. We reject them all. When I first got involved with this in 1982, because I was a vegetarian before then, but I wasn't involved with any animal groups. I was a vegetarian because I went to a slaughterhouse and it freaked me out and I stopped eating meat. The first group I got involved with was in 1982. I got involved with PETA. It was just forming. I met Ingrid Newkirk. I met Alex Pacheco. Anna and I started working with PETA when there were about 10 people. And I was their first lawyer, and she was editing their newsletter. and it was all, you know, wonderful, happy. You know, we were a happy little group of people, and we were vegans. I became a vegan. I had never heard the word until Ingrid introduced me to the word veganism. I thought you would die if you didn't eat some animal protein. And you know, I became a vegan, and I worked with PETA on a volunteer basis. I was either a practicing lawyer, and then I went into the university. But so I've always, you know, I've never had a job with the movement, but I always did legal work on a pro bono basis for these groups. And the main group I worked with was PETA. And one of the main problems we had, it wasn't the only one by far, but one of the main problems we had was in 1989, they announced they were going to start this "I'd rather go naked than wear fur" campaign. And I remember the meeting when it was announced. And everybody thought it was a great idea except me. Mr. Divisive. I didn't think it was divisive at all. I thought it was a matter of common sense. As long as we continue to treat women like meat, we're going to continue to treat animals like meat. This is all related. Nobody goes vegan because some woman who's got lettuce leaves over her breasts comes up and gives them a veggie dog. Nobody goes vegan that way. That has nothing to do with veganism. That has nothing to do with animal rights. That has to do with promoting organizations and getting media attention. And you are not going to stop the exploitation of animals by promoting sexism or racism or heterosexism, anything like that. So in my job, that doesn't mean if you're an animal person, you got to stop what you're doing and get involved with these other movements. You don't have to do that, but you should never use racism or sexism in your advocacy. Okay? Similarly, I tell people, you know, I tell folks who are doing human rights work, you know, I mean, somebody came up to me and said, you know, I'm doing advocacy work for battered women, and you know, and I'm feeling bad. Maybe I should be doing more for animals. And I said, no, keep doing the battered women. That's very important work. You know, violence against women is a major problem. I mean, not just rape, but just violence as a general matter. So you're doing work for battered women, keep doing that work. But you know what? You got to eat 3 times a day. You got to buy a pair of shoes. You got to buy clothes. Just don't buy wool, don't buy leather, and don't stick violence into your mouth. It's that simple. These things are all related. We need to get the interrelationships to be made clear. One thing that I think is, you know, is really sad is there are a group of folks who have emerged on the scene recently called intersectionalists. Now, intersectionalism is a theory that came up that Kim Crenshaw from UCLA developed many years ago, focusing on the fact that black women were discriminated against as women and as people of color. So it's intersectional, that there was overlapping discrimination. I'm a big believer in the fact that there should be no discrimination whatsoever. What concerns me about the new intersectionalists is that they take the position, for example, if you look at what is considered to be a major document in the intersectional movement, that is Sister Vegan, written by Breeze Harper. She makes it very, she criticizes what she calls vegan fundamentalism. Almost all of the essays in that book promote animal exploitation. And you know, this idea that if a person of color or a woman, nobody can tell you that veganism is a moral imperative because it's a matter of cultural relativity. I reject that completely. It is not a matter of cultural relativity. It is a matter of moral realism. It is absolutely wrong to exploit the vulnerable. It's wrong to exploit children. It's wrong to exploit the mentally challenged. It's wrong to exploit non-human animals. And I don't care if you're a person of color. I don't care if you're a feminist who thinks otherwise. I'm sorry. It doesn't. Your status as a woman, your status as a person of color does not mean it's okay for you to exploit. Okay. And finally, the principle of violence. Abolitionists are opposed to violence. I see us as the new peace movement. That's who we are. That's how I regard animal rights and abolition, is that we are the new peace movement. But what we're doing, it was different from the first peace movement that actually I'm old enough to have been involved with, is we didn't think about animals back then. I never thought, I mean, you know, nope. I mean, we really weren't thinking about animals back then. Okay, during the protests against Vietnam and whatnot, we were not thinking about animals. They weren't part of the peace movement. Now we are making them part of the peace movement. We are saying if you speak words of nonviolence while you're shoveling products of torture and death into your mouth, you are not behaving coherently. You are not behaving consistently, and you need to rethink your position fundamentally. And you know, and the idea, it makes me very, I was at Guelph, it was in Canada a few years ago. I was giving a lecture at the University of Guelph, and a person identified herself as with the North American Animal Liberation Front, and said, if a vivisector is using 60 dogs in vivisection, you maintain it's wrong to use violence against the vivisector. And I said, yes, I do. I think what the vivisector is doing is wrong, but I think violence is wrong. And I'm happy if you want to challenge the vivisector. I'm happy if you want to non-violently engage that person or try to stop that person in a non-violent way. But I'm not happy for there to be violence. And it really troubled me when people from the Animal Liberation Front were on 60 Minutes saying, well, you know, if some of these vivisectors got shot, it would really have an effect on vivisection. And so this person who was in the audience at Guelph got very upset with me and said that I was not articulating a morally defensible theory. And I said, no, actually, let's think about it for a second. I said, are you vegan? And she said, yes. I said, is your mom vegan? And she said, what's that got to do? I said, I'm just answering my question. Is your mom vegan? And she said, no. She said, but she doesn't eat beef. I said, great. I said, so what is it that she eats? She eats chicken. I said, she eats chicken a couple times a week? And she said, yes. And I said, fine. Your mother is responsible for at least twice 60 chicken deaths a year, maybe 3 times, 4 times. Is it okay to kill your mother? And she said, it's different. I said, no, it is not different. When you have a society where 95% of the people think that it's fine to exploit animals, proposing violence against 95% of the population is insane, okay? The problem is not, look, if violence would be an answer to anything, we'd be living in the Garden of Eden right now, because the history of humankind, in case you haven't noticed, is a history of violence. We've been killing each other and everything on the planet for thousands of years, and we aren't at a moment of peace yet. We keep hearing this nonsense. We keep hearing, oh, well, I really want peace, but we've got to have yet another war in the Middle East, because in order to get to peace, we've got to have yet another war. Bullshit. That doesn't work. It never has, it never will. The only thing that works is nonviolence. And so I make that at the center of the abolitionist approach to animal rights. I believe it is imperative. I'm violently opposed to violence. And the reality is that if you want to shift the paradigm, there's got to be a revolution. Not a violent revolution, a revolution of the heart. We need to reject violence. You know, I mean, just think about all of the violence that we engage in on a day-to-day basis with what we eat and what we wear, and how our violence to non-humans makes it so much easier for us to be violent towards each other. Because once we've animalized, if you look at the history of this, if you look at the way Hitler characterized the Jews, or the way we characterize, and to some degree still do characterize, people of color. We animalize them, and then whatever we do to them becomes just fine. We otherize them, we animalize them. What would happen if we said, you know what? We've got to stop animalizing animals. We've got to stop justifying and engaging in violence against animals. Imagine what that would do in terms of our treatment of each other. And you know what? It's not really even that crazy. Most people you will meet will agree with you that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. Whatever necessity means is a philosophical matter. If it has any meaning in that moral context, it means that you can't inflict suffering or death for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. We kill 60 billion animals a year and 1 trillion sea animals because they taste good. So if you take seriously the fact that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, you've got no choice but to go vegan. I'm going to leave you with one final story, and then you can rip me apart. This was in the news yesterday. Prevent Farm Animal Cruelty organization puts this article up about this guy, Mr. Largy, admits he'd like to get on a soapbox and tell the world how to raise a better bird. And the Boston Globe has this article, these chickens have a stress-free life and a humane death. Yes, you can taste the difference. And that's how these animals are marketed. Because they are humanely treated, they taste better. And this is a quote. He loves those chickens, says this guy who's a chef. He loves what he does. There's no doubt in my mind that's what makes those chickens so good. And animal people support this. That's an animal group that posted that article. This is exactly the sort of thing that we saw with all of these animal groups supporting Whole Foods, expressing their, quote, appreciation and support for the Whole Foods happy exploitation standard. This is what the movement has become. A group of large, wealthy corporations working with industry to make people feel better about doing the wrong thing. It's got to stop. If we want to shift the paradigm, there's an easy way to shift the paradigm. Go vegan and talk to everybody you can, every single day, about going vegan. We will change the world. Now tell me why I'm wrong. Go ahead.